well, we'll go ahead and get started and let people join as they will. But to kick this off, my name's Jennifer Hurst-Wender, and I'm pleased to be Preservation Virginia's Director of Museum Operations. Today, I have the honor of presenting Dr. Matthew Laird, a partner and senior researcher with the James River Institute for Archaeology. And he's here to discuss the archaeological discoveries from the Bacon's Castle hinterlands. So before I get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Now, I know at this point, I feel like most of the participants have probably attended a webinar or two, and you're probably familiar with how this works, but a good primer never hurt. So I wanted us to get started with, if you look on the bottom of your screen, you'll probably see both a chat box and a Q&A box. So we love to see your comments and we encourage questions. And so I recommend that you use the chat box to comment. So as a test, if our attendees wouldn't mind writing where you're tuning in from and how many people are watching on your device. That'll help us to know where y'all are coming from and how many people are actually watching. So see some people from Richmond, Yorktown, Williamsburg. Thank you all. Wow, all over the place. Well, welcome, and it's good to have you here with us. Now, as we start our presentation, we encourage you to ask questions. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you can write it in the Q&A box, and we're going to answer questions at the end of the presentation. And so if we have more questions and we have time to answer, we're going to try to follow up with you via email after the presentation is completed. And one last thing to note is that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be making it available on our website and our YouTube channel in subsequent weeks. My goodness, we have lots of Virginia people, somebody from Northern Virginia, Ashland, all over the place. That's wonderful. Okay. All right, so just to kind of kick us off, now, so most of you are probably familiar with Preservation Virginia, but if you're not, first of all, I got to say that we are extremely excited to host this webinar. But here's just a little bit about Preservation Virginia. So at 132 years, Preservation Virginia is the nation's oldest statewide historic preservation organization. And our mission is to ensure the relevancy of the Commonwealth's historic places. So we own and operate the John Marshall House, Patrick Henry's home Scotchtown, Bacon's Castle, Smith's Fort, Cape Henry Lighthouse, and historic Jamestown. And we are slowly and carefully reopening these historic sites with COVID precautions in place for those who wish to visit. And for guests who are unable to visit in person at the moment, we have over 30 digital programs and tours available on our website and YouTube channel. So I encourage you to check out our website, our Facebook page, and Instagram, sign up for our e-news, and find out about our upcoming virtual and in-person offerings. So that's kind of one part of what our organization does. The other part is our statewide preservation initiatives. And as an organization, we've helped to save more than 400 historic places throughout the Commonwealth. And that includes our Rosenwald School Architecture Survey, Tobacco Barn Preservation Project, and our General Assembly and Congressional Advocacy for a Future for Shockoe Bottom, the James River, Pine Grove School Community, Rassawick, the historic capital of the Monacan Indian Nation, and more. Most of this work stems from grassroots efforts with communities that know their history better than anyone else. And the majority of our statewide programs come through our annual Most Endangered Historic Places program. So stay tuned in May for this year's announcement. Now I'm going to get ready to share a screen because the next thing that we're going to do before we introduce Dr. Matthew Laird is we're going to go over a little bit of the chronology of Bacon's Castle. So to get started, for those of you who've never been to Bacon's Castle, this is a wonderful aerial shot of the property. And so it was in 1650 that Arthur Allen patented 200 acres. It seems that he operated a mill on that 200 acres, which if you look at this screen would have been just off of this shot to the right. And we've done a little bit of archaeological work. I should mention that the James River Institute for Archaeology has pretty much done every single archaeological dig at Bacon's Castle since the 1970s. Uh, so we have a long-standing relationship with these folks. So by 1665, Arthur Allen had completed work on what would become known as Arthur Allen's brick house. And so if you look at the Bacon's Castle right here, it is the main section that I'm currently circling. That is the 1665 wing of Bacon's Castle. And so unfortunately, Arthur Allen only got to enjoy his new house for 4 years. He dies in 1669 and it's inherited by his son, Arthur Allen II. And it's Arthur Allen II who was born in Surrey, but is educated in England and comes back and upon his return, updates his father's almost medieval style house into a more traditional and contemporary style home. And he adds in, if you see on the left-hand side, the pathways and the rectangles, he adds in a formal garden very similar to what he saw in England. And the garden was actually uncovered in the 1980s thanks to the support of the Garden Club of Virginia. And at this point, I believe that this is the oldest English formal garden in North America. And so this would have been the front entrance at that time to this house. And here is a drawing of what would have been a wooden front porch to enter into Bacon's Castle. So Arthur Allen II is also the owner of Bacon's Castle when Bacon's Rebellion takes place. And so it was he and his family that ended up fleeing Bacon's Castle when it was overtaken by Nathaniel Bacon's rebels in 1676 for several months. And that is, of course, the origin of the moniker Bacon's Castle, instead of how the Allen family probably wished that it would remain, which was Allen's Brick House. And so Arthur Allen passes away, and in 1711, after his death, there is a probate inventory. It's the first one that's done of the house. And so based on that probate inventory, we were able to recreate basically what the house would have looked like in 1711. We only turned one room back to that, but if you come to visit, you'll be able to see our 1711 bedchamber based on Arthur Allen II's inventory. So the house goes from Arthur Allen II to Arthur Allen III. Keep track with all of these Arthur Allens. Arthur Allen III is most well known today because of his wife, Elizabeth Gray Allen. She outlives her husband, Arthur Allen, marries a smith, and then he passes away and she marries a Stith. So it's Elizabeth Gray Allen Smith Stith. And she is the longest single owner of Bacon's Castle. She makes lots of changes and she also outlives all of her children. And so it's at that time that she passes away that the house is inherited by her grandson, who is Alan Cock. And the house basically, so during Elizabeth's time at Bacon's Castle, she makes extensive changes, again, updating it, putting in paneling, putting in walls. And even William Byrd II in his diary visits Allen's house at the time and comments on what a wonderful and delightful housekeeper Elizabeth is at the time. So she's really pretty high in society for the mid 18th century. And Bacon's Castle reflects that. So it's during the Cock ownership that we get this fantastic watercolor. This is done by Richard Herbert Cock in 1815. And while Alan Cock inherits the property from his grandmother, it passes through many members of the Cock family in quick succession. And so in 1810, Robert Herbert Koch is living and owning Bacon's Castle. And you can see the addition that was put on by his grandmother, a little 1.5-story wooden addition. So this is this is an object that's in our collection, and it's a fantastic object. The watercolor you can see it's the piece of paper that's been reused, and if you look close enough at this, you can see faces. So it started out with what looks like a couple of 3/4 profiles of some contemporary people, and then it was repurposed paper to make this wonderful drawing. But it really gives you an idea of what the house looked like in 1815. It's so through the Koch period of residency is when we do have also our slave quarter that still exists on the property. This was constructed in around 1830. And when the Koch family when Robert Koch took ownership in 1810, they had approximately 40 people enslaved. And by 1833, when he passes away, there's 84 people that are enslaved on the property. After the Koch family, it goes to Indiana Henley and her husband, Emmett Robinson, and they most famously inscribed love letters to each other on the window panes. And if you visit, you can see their love letters. After Indiana passes away, Dr. Robinson sells the property. It goes to the Hankins family, who lived there throughout the Civil War. When they sell the property, it goes to the Warren family. And the Warren family lives there until the last descendants pass away in 1972. And it's at that time in 1972 that the house goes up for auction and is purchased by the APVA, which is now Preservation Virginia. And so for the next several years, the house is preserved and conserved, and it's open to the public. But in 1984 is when most of the major restoration work is completed. And in 1755, or I'm sorry, excuse me, not in 1755. In 2015, Bacon's Castle celebrated its 350th anniversary. So it's now 356 years old. And so that is, oh, and there's some work just a few years ago. This was also James River Institute for Archaeology uncovered a really great hearth on the property. So we always say at Bacon's Castle, you cannot put a shovel in the ground without finding a new feature or some sort of archaeology or artifact. And I just like to say that we hold to that rule, and anytime we put a shovel in the ground, we call an archaeologist out. So with that, I welcome you to visit when we're open, and I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Matthew R. Laird, who is a partner and senior researcher with the James River Institute for Archaeology, a cultural resource management firm based in Williamsburg, Virginia, a native of Ottawa, Canada. He earned a Ph.D. in American history from the College of William and Mary in 1995. The mild Virginia climate proved irresistible, and he remained to pursue a career as a historian and archaeologist. He's been fortunate enough to be involved with a wide array of projects spanning thousands of years of human occupation, from Native American campsites through NASA wind tunnels. And his particular research interest is using documentary sources to inform and interpret archaeological investigations. Since 2016, Dr. Laird has served as the principal investigator for the Surrey DMMA project, the results of which he will discuss with us today.
Thank you very much, Jen. And first of all, thank you and to Preservation Virginia for providing this forum for me to share the results of what turned out to be a really fascinating research project in what we've been calling the Hinterlands of Bacon's Castle in Surrey County. Before I get started, though, I really want to take this opportunity to thank Dominion Energy Virginia, not just for sponsoring today's event, but for making the entire archaeological project possible in the first place. They were extremely patient with us throughout the admittedly long excavation process, and I know we can tax people's patience as archaeologists for sure. They throughout provided us with all the resources we needed to do everything to the highest professional standard. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank Schnabel Engineering, who brought us into the project in the first place back when the project began back 5 years ago now in 2016, and provided critical technical assistance throughout the project, and especially during the 2 full years of field work off and on that we were out there. It was definitely a team effort, and we're all still on speaking terms, which I think is wonderful too. So excellent. Rarely, I would say, do we have the opportunity to do an archaeological project which allows us to cover the full span of historical period settlement in Virginia from the 17th century right on up through the 20th century. And so today, I want to take the opportunity to share with you the results of our research on 2 of the very significant archaeological sites that we investigated in the course of this project. I chose these mainly because both have a direct association with Bacon's Castle, which we've just learned a little bit about through Jen this morning, and also through the lives and the livelihoods of the Allen family themselves, and various people, many of them anonymous, who we don't know, who lived and worked and also we know died on the property throughout the colonial period. So to set the stage, people always ask us, how do you know where to dig? Well, in this case, we actually didn't get to choose where we were going to dig. Dominion was planning to construct a 60-acre dredged material management area, or DMMA for short, to support the activities at the Surrey Power Station, which is on Hog's Neck in this part of the world here. This is the James River. They needed a location which was in relatively close proximity to the power station, and there were really, based on environmental constraints, they selected an area which was about 3 miles to the south of the power station in Surrey County, just to the west of Lawns Creek. So to orient you, we have the James River and Lawns Creek, right to the east, which is the eastern border of the project area. This project required permits from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the dredging that was going to occur. So that meant that an archaeological survey was required to meet the requirements of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But this requires federal agencies in a situation where they're issuing a permit or funding to take into consideration the effect that this undertaking might have on significant cultural resources, whether that's standing historic structures or archaeological sites. So we began with a preliminary, what we would call a phase 1 preliminary archaeological survey of the footprint of the DMMA. And we identified right off the bat 8 historic archaeological sites. So we go through a process of evaluating which of these are the most significant. And so we did what we would call more intensive phase 2 level investigations of these. And in consultation with the Corps and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, which was an important partner in this project, everyone concurred that 4 of the 8 archaeological sites we had identified were significant enough to warrant further investigation, since they were going to be directly impacted by the construction of this project. So at that point, the Corps of Engineers, the Department of Historic Resources, Preservation Virginia as well, we entered into a partnership and formally prepared a memorandum of agreement, or an MOA, which would guide the process going forward. And the partners decided that full-scale, what we would call phase 3 excavation or data recovery, was going to be required for these 4 sites before they were impacted by the construction project. So we put together a research plan, which all the partners approved, and we began the work in the spring of 2018. So it's just about 3 years ago now that we began that archaeological work. just to set the stage here, zooming in just a little bit, these are the two archaeological sites that I'm going to be discussing today. They have the very intriguing names 44 SY 0274 and 0277. For those of you who aren't familiar with how we record archaeological sites in Virginia, just briefly, 44, Virginia is the 44th state alphabetically. So that's the prefix. SY stands for Surry County. Each county or independent city gets its own designation. And then as archaeological sites are recorded, they're numbered sequentially. So these were the 274th and 277th sites that were recorded in Surry County. So you can see the location of them too here. This is very important. Look to the west here. Here is Bacon's Castle, which Jen was just showing us some images of. You can see we're literally right down the road from Bacon's Castle. It's less than 2 miles as the crow flies between the project area that we were investigating and Bacon's Castle. And what's interesting is, I pointed out before, Lawns Creek. It's important to remember it's still navigable today to some extent, but there's been a lot of siltation that's occurred. Back in the 17th century, when Surry County, this part of Surry County was first being settled, this would have been navigable to shallow draft vessels coming right off the James River. So this really would have been almost like the on-ramp for the transportation superhighway, which was the James River. Bacon's Castle here, originally it was landlocked. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how the Allens of Bacon's Castle happened to acquire this property, but doing the background historic research, it was very clear that very early on there was a road, which still exists today in various forms, that linked Bacon's Castle, you can see this dotted line, I think, to our project area, and then to Lawns Creek, where historically there was a landing. So you can see why acquiring this property would have been very important for Bacon's Castle. This would have provided an outlet for all their goods, tobacco and things that they were shipping out directly to England, and also ingress for all the imported goods that they were receiving right to Bacon's Castle. Just to give you a basic timeline, this is always the first thing I do when I tackle a project, is try to establish who owned this property. And in this case, it's very important to understand this, to interpret what we were finding and to sort of make sense of what we were seeing in terms of the archaeology. So this was one of the earliest areas of Surry County that was first established. The first land grant was issued to Captain William Pierce, who has important Jamestown connections. 2,000-acre Lawns Creek plantation property was first granted in 1635. But what's interesting is really throughout the rest of the 17th and into the very early 18th century, this big chunk of land was actually owned by non-resident owners, the Bland family of London merchants. They're based in London. They occasionally had members of the family who did reside in Virginia and kind of manage their operations. But essentially through this whole period, it was non-resident land. Now they certainly would have had tenant farmers growing tobacco on the property, and we're gonna see that is probably who we're looking at in terms of the archaeological record here for the early period of the sites. Now, where it gets important to understand the connection with Bacon's Castle is in 1707, Major Arthur Allen II of Bacon's Castle, just down the road, purchased this property from the Blands. So again, I think you can see why, having looked at that map, why this would have been a key acquisition for Major Allen. This now gave them access to Lawns Creek. And so that road that connects the two properties, even still, I'm sure was established around that time if it wasn't there already. And it essentially gave them that on-ramp to the James River and markets beyond. We've already heard a little bit about Elizabeth Bray Allen Smith Stith, and I have to make sure I get all those names in there. I think her name itself is just typical of early Virginia history. I think all of you who are familiar with what life was like for people in colonial Virginia, early death was just a fact of life, and remarriage was probably the norm rather than the exception. And so Elizabeth was married 3 times throughout her long life. She, as Jen already mentioned, outlived her children, and so she was, for a long time was the person most associated with Bacon's Castle. And what's fascinating is that I was beginning the research for this. What I realized is that from at least the very early 19th century, and I suspect earlier, right on up through the 20th century, this property that we were working on was historically known as Stiths. Now that's very interesting because the Stith family is not really present in Surrey County. And so trying to figure out how did this name become associated with this property? And it goes right on up through the 20th century. My theory is, I think it makes the most amount of sense that when this property was at its height, at its zenith, Elizabeth would have been in charge of Bacon's Castle. And so I think just locally, this became known as Stith's Plantation, probably just to distinguish it from the main core of Bacon's Castle, because by that time, they owned literally thousands of acres surrounding Bacon's Castle. The property, Jen can remind us what the acreage is that Preservation Virginia owns now, but it was many thousands of acres by this time and included this parcel. So I think that's where the Stiths name originates, and this will be significant a little bit later. And so after the extended Allen family had occupied the property, it then gets into the Wilson family, kind of in the latter part of the 19th century. We know they lived on the property. We have maps that show where their houses were, and they all sort of smack dab on top of each other. And then throughout the 20th century, again, it became sort of non-resident landowners, and we know that there were tenants living there as well. So we're really seeing overlaps of occupation on the same piece of property from the 17th century on up through the 18th, 19th, and right up into the 20th century. So part of our job is to try to sort all that out. I'm going to start with the earliest of the two sites. This was that 274 site, which was sort of up in the northeast corner, so a little bit closer to Lawns Creek. This is what we determined is probably a tenant farmstead, definitely a modest domestic occupation that included 6 burials, roughly in the time period of about 1680 to 1720. So how do we know what that is? Anyone who's has any experience with Virginia archaeology will recognize this in the 17th and into the very early 18th century. The vast majority of people living in Virginia, whether they were white or enslaved Africans, lived in very, very modest houses, which were built in what we would call an earth-fast or posting ground style of architecture, which literally meant putting the structural framing posts directly into the ground and building what was always a frame house on top of that. And so it's very, very common, if you've ever worked on or seen a 17th century Virginia site, it's very common to see this style of house. And so that's exactly what we found at this site. It consisted of 8 main structural posts. The whole building itself was relatively small. We would consider this a tiny house, I guess, today, but this was really typical, if not on the larger side for average people. It measured about 34 feet long by 21 feet wide. We didn't see any evidence that the interior space was divided. It may have been a single room. It probably would have had no more than 2 basic rooms. And the only other feature, aside from these post holes that was associated with the building, was, I think you might be able to see the outline. This is what archaeologists call a subfloor pit. It's also familiarly called a root cellar. These were typically in front of the hearth, and it would have been a buried storage area where you could keep root vegetables through the winter or other things. So this would have been under the floorboards. This is really the only feature we'll see. Now, it's important to remember that with posts set directly in the ground, if you've ever built a fence in your backyard and it starts to lean after a while, this is exactly what happens in Virginia. And the lifespan of these houses is really only about 25 years unless you do repairs to these posts. And we can see repairs in the archaeological record, and these do not have those. So we really can infer from this that this house did not stand for any longer than maybe 20 or 25 years before it was abandoned, and maybe considerably less than that. So here, this is a plan view. You can see the outline of the house here. These are the posts, that's root cellar. This is what a post hole looks like when you excavate it. This is now cut in half, so it's been sectioned. So I think you can see this would have been the original hole that was excavated. And then the post was set in that, filled back in. Over time, the post rotted, and this dark soil here slumped in. And so you can actually see the perfect outline, at least that's half of it in section of one of the posts. Now, this is just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. This is a reconstructed earth-fast house from historic St. Mary's City in Maryland, and another sketch of another house, something that we had excavated in the Williamsburg area, 17th century house. And this gives you a sense, this has multiple root cellars. This might not have all been used at one time, but they pretty typically would fill one in and do another one, or so you often have a whole complex, but we just had one. So again, all the evidence is pointing to a relatively short occupation for this particular house. Found a really interesting assortment of artifacts. There was material in the plowed soils around the site. And we also had several other subsurface features which we could excavate, which were probably trash pits, and probably actually dug initially to collect clay to use for the construction of the house. And in this case, this house almost certainly had a wattle and daub or clay chimney, as opposed to there was no brick foundation or chimney associated with this house. So in some of these features, we recovered this musket barrel, hoe blade here, which you'll probably recognize this tool. They're really ubiquitous on colonial era sites that we excavate. This would have been a primary tool for tobacco cultivation. This key, unfortunately, we did not find the chest that this key unlocked, just the key itself. So we don't know what that was associated with, but some very interesting artifacts that give us a sense not just of, these people's status and what they were doing, but again, the time period that they were living here, which is one of the main questions we're always trying to answer. Lawns Creek ware, it's also sometimes called chalice ware. It's really fascinating. This is a local product. There was probably an itinerant potter, someone who changed his pottery locations all kind of through the James River, lower James River Valley and the Williamsburg area. It's actually called Lawns Creek ware because the first kiln site identified with this production of the pottery is literally just to the east of where we were working on Lawns Neck. And so it's a very basic utilitarian stoneware. This would have been affordable for most people, and it would have been kind of typical domestic kitchenware, that sort of thing. So it's not unusual or surprising to find that kind of ware on this site. As you probably know, clay tobacco pipes are really everywhere on sites of this time period, and occasionally we get lucky, and some of them, especially the ones that were imported from England, they were often stamped with a maker's mark. In this particular case, we found this relatively complete example here, which was stamped by the maker Llewellyn Evans, who was operating, I believe, in London, but in the time period of 1680 to 1710. So again, a really good clue of when people were living at this site. What's also interesting is these just look like lumps of clay, which really they are, but what someone was doing here was actually fashioning what we call local or Chesapeake clay tobacco pipes. There were various periods when these pipes were either hard to get because we were fighting with the Dutch and trade was interrupted, or they were expensive. And so people actually there was kind of a local industry of making tobacco pipes, and we actually have evidence that they were making these on site. So that's interesting in and of itself, just to find this kind of waste material. So here's a bit of an overview of the site. Again, here are our posts from the structure. And as we removed, with a backhoe, we can mechanically strip all the topsoil, the plowed topsoil from this area, finding these features. We found these telltale signs of human burials, and you can see this is relatively close. This is really just less than 50 feet away from the dwelling. Now, I should say, before I get into a discussion of the human remains that we found at the site, I just wanted to remind everybody that, when we have the opportunity to excavate human remains, it's a very serious responsibility, and we take it with a lot of reverence and care, as you can imagine. And so just in that spirit, I have not included in the presentation any photographs of the human remains themselves. I want to show some shots of us excavating the graves and the grave features themselves, and then the reburial, which we also did, which I want to mention. But if anyone for any reason does not feel like they'd like to look at these photographs, the next few slides are going to be showing this. I just wanted to let people know. So this is a detail of how they were arrayed. So you can see pretty clearly we've got 6 burial features. They seem to be they're all clustered relatively closely together. So that suggests to us that they were buried roughly within, a relatively short span of time. Now, these were not marked in any way. We only discovered these by stripping the topsoil. But the way they're arranged suggests to us that maybe there were markers originally, or at least the people who were doing these burials knew where they were, at least for the length of time that this site was occupied. So we've got really 3 groups of 2. Based just on the size of the grave features alone, we could determine, at least it looked initially like we were probably dealing with 4 adults, 1 maybe younger adult or child, and then unfortunately, just given the small size of this grave feature here, probably an infant or a very small child. If you're wondering what these kind of streaks are running through, these are what we call plow scars. After these burials were abandoned and forgotten about, these farm field that these were located in was plowed on up well on up into the 20th century, and especially early plowing is much deeper. And so these are actually a scar that was created by the blade of the plow. It was dragging down into the sandy clay subsoil, which is underneath the topsoil. So at about a foot or a foot and a half below the present ground surface. So that's what those features are. So initially, before we can do anything, once we've identified these, it's imperative that we obtain a permit from the Department of Historic Resources, the DHR, in order to archaeologically excavate these. And so it's incumbent on us to put together a research plan which describes how we're going to conduct the excavation, who we are going to consult with in the course of the excavation based on who we suspect these individuals might have been associated with, and how we are going to have the human remains analyzed to gain as much information as we can from that. And then finally, what the final disposition of the remains is going to be. So we have to work all that out in advance before we can do any excavation at all. And so again, Preservation Virginia was very helpful in assisting with this, and Dominion obviously as well, and the DHR. At the time, we really weren't sure at this point whether these were indentured white tenants on the property. Just given this time period, this was right around the time when the workforce of Virginia was starting to change from indentured white servants to enslaved Africans. So just based on the time period of this site, there was a possibility that these might have been enslaved Africans. We thought it was probably more likely that they were white indentured tenants, but we didn't know for sure. And so we were sure to consult with the African American community and scholars too, just in anticipation of this. As it turned out, as I'll describe in a little bit, they really were white indentured servants, we think, that we were able to discern. So just moving on, we began the process of excavation once we had received our permit from the Department of Historic Resources. As always seems to happen, when it's the worst possible time, we started to get a lot of rain and flooding at the time. So it was a constant process of trying to keep these as dry and bailed out as possible, but we were able to do this. Unfortunately, what we encountered though, is the fact that nature and time had done more damage than recent rains or groundwater ever did. I think just, it really depends what kind of soil remains are buried in, which dictates what sort of state of preservation they're in. And I think probably a combination of the wetness of these particular soils in this part of the field, the high acidity of it, it meant that the skeletal remains were extremely disintegrated. It's very disappointing. We always feel like we're going to this trouble and effort, and we want to learn as much as we can about these individuals. And obviously, the more intact the remains, the better state of preservation, the more that we can learn from these. But unfortunately, these just had not really stood the test of time. This is one of the adult grave features. In this drawing, we've sketched the remaining visible portions of the skeleton, which we could see. The ideal is if the skeletal remains are in good condition, ideally we would remove them and bring them back to the lab for analysis. In this case, sometimes we can actually excavate them in block too if they're relatively fragile. So essentially take out all the soil surrounding them and lift that out as a single piece and transport it that way. In this case, and we consulted again, we were working with Dr. Douglas Owsley of the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution as our forensic anthropology consultant. He visited. We just determined that these were so fragile, the remains were in such fragile condition, it just wasn't going to be possible to remove individual bones. And in some cases, the bone, it might even be visible, but literally just didn't exist any more than a stain in the soil. And so what we determined was that we would actually just recover as much of the remains and the surrounding soil matrix as we could to preserve that, because in some cases we just couldn't distinguish between what was soil and what was human remains. And so to take the utmost care and respect and to treat these with dignity, in many cases we wound up really removing a lot of the fill soil and treating it all as though they were human remains in this process. This is a different grave. I think what is interesting here is, so you can see as we've excavated, this would have been the grave shaft that was initially dug. These all, with the possible exception of the infant burial, but we think it may have been as well, these had hexagonal wood coffins. And I think you can actually see the outline of it. So the wood is basically kind of become the consistency of wet cardboard at this point, but we're able to see it. And this is actually the base of the coffin here. So you can see that this was an important fact, because often, probably the poorest people in Virginia would have just been buried during this time period with just wrapped in a sheet or shroud burial. Here, these people had the means or the wherewithal to construct relatively complex coffins. These aren't even just a simple rectangle. These take some skill to construct. And so we're starting to get a picture of who these people were just based on the building they were living in, the artifacts they were using, and now from their remains themselves. What's fascinating is that even though we had very little skeletal remains to work with, Dr. Owsley was able to look at some surviving teeth from 2 of the individuals, and they were able to do some analysis on that. I think based on just the morphology or the shape of the teeth, he was able to determine that they were most likely of European ancestry. They were also able to do isotopic analysis of the teeth. And that essentially is like a chemical signature that we all have, and it's formed very early in our lives, and it's dependent on kind of our diet and our environment when we're first growing and our teeth are forming. And so based on the analysis of the 2 sets of teeth that he was able to do, they were able to determine that these were individuals who were native to the Chesapeake area. So they were of European background, but probably born in Virginia, probably in Surry County. So at this point, we had 2 individuals, the 2 individuals who had the teeth. One was a child. He determined was probably about 4 or 5 years of age. And the other was a young adult, probably 18 to 20 years old. We don't know the age of the others. And sadly, we also don't know the identity of these people. We do have some clues. When Major Allen acquired this property from the Blands in 1707, the deed noted that there were a number of tenant families who were living on the property at that time. And so they had names like Seat and Barnes, Moreland, Duchy, Ezell, Peters, and Tanner. So we'll never know for sure, but these individuals may have been members of some of those families. So as I said before, a very important part of this process is not just excavating and studying the remains, but giving them a proper and respectful reburial as well. And so the parties in consulting together determined that really the most suitable place to rebury them was at what's known as the Old Brick or former Lawns Creek Church. If any of you have visited Bacon's Castle and know this area, this property is literally just down the road. It was the site of a 17th century church, and then the remains of the 18th century brick church are still there. The cemetery is managed today, it's still actively used by the Bacon's Castle Memorial Association. They manage it. And so in consultation with them, they very kindly allowed us to conduct a reburial ceremony at this cemetery. So we very carefully, all the collected remains went into these vaults and they were reburied. We had a Christian reburial ceremony that was officiated by Reverend Gary Livermore of the Methodist Church of Virginia, and had the ceremony, which was attended by a number of people. And today, Dominion has provided this headstone for the graves. So the people who visit the cemetery today and still actively used will know. And we've also been working with them on some interpretive signage, which very soon is going to be installed at the cemetery too. So visitors will get some idea of, where these individuals came from and what their lives were like and who they were and how they wound up in this place. Secondly, I'm running very short on time. I've talked too long already, so I just want to very, very briefly talk about a second site, which is very important too, because this really gave us much more insight into how Bacon's Castle, the larger Bacon's Castle, was operating in the 18th century.